All right, let's dive into the early 1800s in America. And this period wasn't just formative, it was a crucible. Seriously, the very idea of what America was supposed to be was being fought over, tested, and forged in the fire of these grand visions, and frankly, some shocking contradictions. The decisions made back then, they still echo today.
And if you want to boil this entire chaotic era down to one single idea, it's this question right here. This is the central conflict that's going to define not just a presidency, but the entire future of the nation. Keep this in mind as we go.
So our story really kicks off in a nation that felt like it was tearing itself apart. The election of 1800, look, it wasn't just another political contest. It was a battle for the very soul of America, a major clash between two completely different visions for the future.
Okay, so on one side you've got the Federalists, led by a guy you might have heard of, Alexander Hamilton. They imagined an America powered by manufacturing and industry, all guided by a really strong, centralized government. But on the other side, you had Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans. Their ideal America? A nation of small, independent farmers, where the federal government stayed small and stayed out of their way. Two totally opposing worlds.
So when Jefferson actually won, people called it a revolution. But here's the most revolutionary part. It was peaceful. I mean, think about it. In a world where power almost always changed hands through war and bloodshed, this was, well, it was unheard of. It was the first real proof that this young American experiment, with its Constitution and its institutions, might actually work.
So, Jefferson takes office, and he is determined to put his small government philosophy into practice. But, the messy reality of actually governing a country was about to collide with his ideals in a way he absolutely could not have seen coming.
And to be fair, at first he was true to his word. He got right to work. He repealed the hated whiskey tax, he shrank the size of the military, he cut a bunch of federal jobs, and he started paying down the national debt. Every single one of those moves was a clear signal that he was trying to dismantle the powerful federal machine the Federalists had spent years building. And this is where the whole story pivots. Jefferson's absolute commitment to a small, limited government is about to face the opportunity of a lifetime, one that would force him to choose between his most cherished principles and the nation's destiny. And that opportunity came with a price tag, $15 million. See, Napoleon was busy with his wars in Europe and desperately needed cash. So, out of the blue, he offers to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. For $15 million, America could literally double in size, overnight.
Now, for Jefferson, this was a massive, massive crisis. His whole political philosophy was built on strict construction, this core belief that the government can only do what the Constitution explicitly says it can do. And the problem? The Constitution was completely silent on the idea of buying foreign land. It just wasn't in there.
But at the end of the day, the deal was just too good to ignore. Jefferson made a pragmatic choice. He basically decided that securing the Mississippi River for trade and gaining all that land for future generations, well, it outweighed his constitutional worries. So, in an incredible twist, the president who preached the limits of federal power used that very power to make one of the biggest federal moves in history.
Okay, but while Jefferson is expanding the power of the presidency, a key Federalist rival is making his own brilliant power play. Chief Justice John Marshall. He realized that even if his party couldn't win elections anymore, he could build a powerful, lasting federal government from his seat on the Supreme Court.
Marshall's entire strategy, his whole game plan, hinged on establishing one single game-changing concept for the court. And it all comes down to this one question.
And the answer is judicial review. It's the power of the Supreme Court to look at any law passed by Congress or any action taken by the president and say, nope, that's unconstitutional. This is the ultimate check on the other branches of government. And believe it or not, before John Marshall, this incredible power wasn't really a sure thing.
And the way he cemented this power was pure genius. In this landmark case, Marbury v. Madison, Marshall's court first ruled that, yes, Judge Marbury totally deserved his job. But then came the brilliant catch. He said the law that allowed Marbury to bring his case directly to the Supreme Court was itself unconstitutional. So by giving up a tiny bit of power in the short term, he grabbed the ultimate power, the final say on the Constitution for the court forever. It was a masterstroke. And he wasn't finished. A few years later, in another huge case, McCulloch v. Maryland, Marshall's court established that federal law is supreme over state law. This was another major nail in the coffin for states' rights, and another huge win for a strong central government.
Now, the country wasn't just being shaped by these big internal power struggles.
The world was a dangerous place, and constant conflicts with European powers were forcing the young United States to figure out its place on the world stage, often with really divisive results back home.
You can just feel the pressure mounting, year after year. First, you have the Barbary Wars, forcing the U.S. to deploy its new navy against pirates. Then, the British started their practice of impressment, which was basically kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. Each crisis just pushed the U.S. closer and closer to the edge.
Jefferson's big idea to deal with all this was the Embargo Act of 1807. He thought if he just cut off all foreign trade, this economic pressure would force Britain and France to respect American neutrality. Instead, it was an absolute disaster. It crippled the American economy, especially in the shipping hubs of New England, and made the political divisions in the country even deeper.
Finally, all that tension just boiled over into the War of 1812. Fueled by outrage over impressment and a new aggressive generation of politicians called war hawks, the U.S. declared war on Great Britain. But the country was anything but united. In fact, in New England, angry Federalists were so against the war they held the Hartford Convention, where some even talked about seceding from the Union.
And here's the biggest irony of the whole war. Militarily, it was pretty much a stalemate. But for Americans, it felt like a huge victory, like they had stood up to Great Britain a second time and won. This sparked a massive wave of nationalism. And the Federalists, who had so loudly opposed this popular war, they were suddenly seen as unpatriotic, and their party just, well, it effectively collapsed.
So when you step back, you see how all of these contradictions, a small government president making the country bigger, a divisive war creating national unity, they all came together to produce an America that was completely transformed, not just in its size, but in its whole sense of self. So, with the Louisiana Purchase in the bag, it was time to actually see what America had just bought. You had the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition, which mapped that vast new territory and staked a claim all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Then you had Zebulon Pike exploring the Southwest. His reports of a great American desert were a bit off, but they shaped how people thought about that region for decades.
All right, so what are the big takeaways here? What should we remember from this whole era? First, federal power grew in ways nobody, especially not Jefferson, ever expected. Second, the idea of westward expansion became a core part of the American identity. Third, that classic American argument, federal power versus states' rights, was cemented as the central debate in our politics. And finally, we see this crucial lesson in leadership. Sometimes practical reality has to overrule even your most deeply held beliefs.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Thomas Jefferson, the ultimate champion of small government, left the nation bigger, more powerful, and more centralized than ever before. So what was it? Was it a betrayal of everything he stood for? Or was it the birth of a uniquely American kind of pragmatism, an understanding that to build a nation, ideals sometimes have to bend to reality? That's the contradiction, and it's right at the heart of the American story.